right, everybody, welcome to something that I've honestly been looking forward to for a long time on Chaos Cinema. Today, we're starting a brand new journey on the channel, and I think it's one that's going to be a lot of fun for all of us. We're going to go all the way back through every single episode of Star Trek The Next Generation, all 176 of them, starting with Encounter at Farpoint, and we're going to work our way episode by episode until we reach All Good Things. Now, the goal isn't to just recap these episodes. You can find plot summaries all over YouTube. I want to revisit them almost 40 years later, see how they actually hold up, what still works, what doesn't work, what details did we completely miss the first time around. I mean, which characters were already full formed, which ones still had a long way to go. And along the way, we're going to keep a running ranking of every episode. Every week, another one goes on the list, and by the time we're finished, we're going to have our own definitive ranking of every episode of The Next Generation, from worst to best. And this is by far my favorite era of Trek. I have a feeling some episodes we'll all remember as classics, and they may not be quite as good as nostalgia tells us they are. I think we're going to rediscover some forgotten gems as well. I think that's what makes it fun. Stick around to the end because we're going to rate each episode as well. So there's only really one place to begin, and I'll have a playlist below where all of these will be housed. And if you guys enjoy this series, drop a like, show some support, leave me a comment. This could be fun. Now, it's almost impossible to explain to younger Star Trek fans just how risky this show actually was. For nearly 20 years, Trek was Kirk, Kirk was Trek, Spock, McCoy. We had movies, but when people thought about Star Trek, that's who they pictured. And then Paramount decides they're bringing Trek back to television, except this time, they're going to do it with none of those characters. No Kirk in the captain's chair, no Spock raising an eyebrow from the science station, no familiar faces to ease longtime fans into a new adventure. Instead, we're introduced to an enormous galaxy-class starship. Looks nothing like the old Enterprise. I mean, we have a bald French captain played by a Shakespearean actor. Let that sink in. We have a Klingon wearing a Starfleet uniform. We have an android searching for humanity, and before we've even learned everybody's names, we have an all-powerful being that appears out of nowhere. Literally puts the human race on trial. And looking back at it now, it's actually kind of amazing this show even got the chance to succeed. I mean, watching Encounter at Farpoint today is, for me, it's a strange experience because we simply know too much. We know where Picard ends up. We know what Data becomes. I mean, we know Worf is going to have one of the richest character arcs in all of Trek history. We know all of it. The Borg are coming. We know Q is going to become one of the most important reoccurring characters in the franchise. We even know how this entire series ends. That completely changes the way you watch this premiere. So instead of asking whether Encounter at Farpoint was a good pilot back in 1987, I would rather ask, does it still work after everything we've seen since then? Maybe even more importantly, how much of the DNA of The Next Generation is already sitting here in episode 1? So the first thing that jumps out to me is the Enterprise D itself. I love this ship. I know it has its critics, and I know there are fans who still prefer Kirk's Enterprise or even later designs, but every single time I see that sweeping shot of the Enterprise D gliding through space, it just feels like home to me. It's bright, comfortable, unbelievably spacious. There's families on board, children running through the corridors. You've got lounges with giant windows. There's carpeting everywhere. It was less of a warship and more of an actual flying city. That was a huge shift from what Trek had been before. The original Enterprise always felt like a naval vessel exploring the unknown. The Enterprise D, it felt like humanity had become so confident in its place among the stars that it built floating communities. And it just sent them off exploring. Now, whether you love the design or not, it immediately tells you this is not going to be the original series all over. This is trying to be something new. Then we meet Jean-Luc Picard. Honestly, one of the things that shocked me probably the most rewatching the episode is just how different he feels from the Picard that we all kind of carry in our heads. I mean, the authority was already there. Patrick Stewart walks onto the bridge and completely owns every single scene that he's in. You believe this man is the captain from the very first moment you lay eyes on him, but there's also a distance to him that I didn't remember. He's very formal, reserved. He's almost uncomfortable around people outside of Starfleet protocol. I mean, his dislike of children is practically a personality trait in this first episode, and I know that becomes a running joke over the years, but it also tells us something important about where his character started. This isn't the Picard who will eventually sit around a poker table with the senior staff or quietly mentor Data through questions about humanity. All of those relationships, they don't exist. Right now, these officers are not his family. They are simply the crew that he's been assigned to command. And I kind of forget that until I watch it. I mean, watching it now, I actually think this is one of the things that I'm going to enjoy tracking through the series. At what point does Jean-Luc stop commanding a ship and he actually starts being the leader of the crew and they actually build friendships? I don't remember when that transformation actually happens, and I'm kind of curious to watch it unfold as we go through this series. Now, before we really have a chance to settle into the new version of Star Trek, Q literally crashes the party. That's where hindsight completely changes the experience for me. You guys let me know if you agree or disagree. Imagine watching this in 1987 with no idea who Q is. He'd probably come across as this weird villain of the week. I mean, John Delancey shows up in ridiculous costumes. He freezes people, he tosses the Enterprise around like a toy, and then he transports our crew into, I guess you could just say, the most surreal post-apocalyptic courtroom there is. It's theatrical, it's over the top, it's weird. But watching it today, knowing everything that we know about Q, I don't really think that he's the villain of the episode at all. In fact, I would argue he's the entire reason that the premiere actually still feels important. He's not interested in conquering the Federation. He wasn't trying to destroy the Enterprise. He was acting as a philosophical question that's going to define this series for 7 years or 7 seasons. I mean, has humanity evolved? Or are we just pretending we move beyond our violent past? Kind of sounds like real life. That's a fascinating way to me to introduce a brand new Trek series. Most franchises would have opened with a giant battle, flashy new enemy to hook the audiences. Instead, Gene Roddenberry opens with an argument about whether humanity deserves to explore the galaxy in the first place. I mean, how deep is that? That's a Trek idea. I think it's thoughtful instead of just explosive. And while I do understand how some viewers back then in 87 probably expected more action, I also think this choice is one of the reasons The Next Generation has aged so well. It asks questions instead of just showing special effects. And then there's another layer to Q's trial that I really don't think fully hit me until I watched this episode again. The first time through, it kind of felt like a self-contained premise, right? Humanity on trial, we get it. Picard has to prove we're better than our past. And once the episode ends, that was the end of it. It wasn't. We know that now. Knowing where the series goes now 40 years later, we can understand some of those original viewers couldn't possibly know. The trial never ended. 7 seasons later, we arrive at All Good Things, and Q is still talking about humanity's trial. So the very first episode and the very last episode, they're connected by the exact same philosophical question. I think that's incredible planning, whether it's intentional from the beginning or something that writers brilliantly circle back to in the room years later. I don't care. Watching Encounter at Farpoint now almost feels like reading the opening chapter of a novel after you've already finished the last page. You notice scenes that didn't mean anything the first time around. So the rewatch, right? One thing that's got me wondering, and this is obviously just my interpretation, I mean, is Q already, did he already know Jean-Luc was different? So later in the series, their relationship is personal, right? Q challenges him, he frustrates him, teaches him, exposes him to the Borg, all that stuff. He even helps him in ways that don't become obvious until much later. But watching the first meeting, I don't know. I don't know if Q was simply putting humanity on trial, or if he'd already singled out Picard as someone worth testing. Maybe I'm reading too much into it because I know where their story goes, but it's kind of hard not to see the beginning of something larger. One of the things I keep asking throughout the series is whether moments like this were intentional foreshadowing, or whether later writers simply found brilliant ways to build on what was already there. I don't know. Either way, that's part of the fun of revisiting these episodes. We're not just watching what happens, we're looking at how the entire Star Trek universe grew from moments that originally seemed smaller than they actually were. So, as Picard manages to convince Q to give us another chance, the Enterprise sets course for Farpoint Station, and that is where, to me, the actual mystery and intrigue of the episode actually starts. I mean, before we leave the opening act behind, I do want to say this. It's worth saying, this might become a recurring theme during the series. Even in its first hour, The Next Generation feels confident about what kind of stories it wanted to tell. The acting isn't completely settled, I know. Some of the dialogue's stiff for sure, and there is rough edges that we're going to talk about as we go. But the heart of the show, it was there. Exploration, curiosity, big ideas, moral dilemmas. Those are things that I feel ultimately made TNG really special. I don't think that's by accident. I really don't. So we finally get to Farpoint Station, and then we get our first introduction to Commander William T. Riker. And I've always kind of found it interesting that if anybody in the first episode feels like a traditional Trek leading man, I think it's Riker. It's not Picard. Jonathan Frakes kind of brings that energy. It's completely different from Patrick Stewart. Riker's confident, relaxed, charming. He carries himself with just enough, dare I say, swagger that you can immediately understand why people follow him. He's willing to take chances. He trusts his instincts. I mean, he's a little less formal than his captain. And looking back now, I actually think that is what made this work. I think that's what made the Picard and Riker relationship actually end up working. If Picard had another version of himself as first officer, well, they'd all spend their time overthinking every decision. I think Riker was the balance, the yin and the yang. And if there's ever a Kirk essence, Riker definitely had that. He was willing to challenge Picard when he needed to, but he also knew when to step back and let the captain lead. Now, that dynamic isn't there yet in this episode, but you can see the foundation being laid. It's also funny knowing Jonathan Frakes would eventually become one of Trek's most accomplished directors, too, which is crazy. I mean, watching him here, he's just beginning a journey that is going to end up lasting decades in front and behind the camera. So, Riker meets Lieutenant Commander Data, and then, to me, this is one of those moments that lands completely different after I've watched it again 40 years later. If you somehow erase the rest of the TNG from your memory and you only watched Encounter at Farpoint, probably would not guess that this android is going to become one of the most, I mean, honestly, greatest science fiction characters ever created. In my opinion, Brent Spiner, fantastic. Data, he hasn't even become Data. He's stiffer than he'll eventually be. The writers are experimenting with exactly how childlike or socially unaware they want him to be. So for me, what stood out is the central idea of the character. Data wasn't trying to become more powerful. He isn't trying to become more intelligent. He wasn't trying to be like the Borg necessarily. He already surpassed humans in every measurable way, right? He was stronger, faster, smarter, processed information, but he wanted the one thing that you and me take for granted. He wanted to understand what it actually means to be human. Now, I watch this now, knowing where he eventually leads. I mean, the emotion chip, some of the greatest episodes we've ever had. It's clearly the goal. It was established within the first few minutes of us meeting him on camera. So their conversation introduced us to something that quietly becomes one of the biggest recurring characters in the entire franchise, the holodeck. It's hilarious in hindsight because Starfleet presents it in this like it's another room on the ship. I mean, here's a place where you could create any environment you can imagine. Okay, sounds harmless, right? All I could think of watching this was you people have no idea what you've unleashed with the holodeck. I mean, over the next 7 seasons, the holodeck is going to create sentient villains. We're going to trap crew members inside simulations, malfunctions. It's going to become self-aware. It's going to threaten the ship. I think it generally tries to kill somebody multiple times. So by season 5, you would think somebody at Starfleet headquarters would have looked at the incident report and said, you know what? Let's stop putting holodecks in our starships. But in this moment right now, it was brand new. And it was one more example of how optimistic Gene and this version of Trek wanted to be. Technology wasn't presented as something to fear. It was actually presented as another tool for exploration. But it ends up being kind of homicidal, which is actually kind of funny. So then we get to one of my favorite scenes in the entire premiere. Barely connected to the plot, I don't care. We have Admiral Leonard McCoy walks onto the Enterprise D. I think this scene means more today to me than it did in 1987. I know it does. DeForest Kelley was already a legend to me, and having Bones to be one of the original series characters to appear, I loved it. He wasn't there to save the day, steal the spotlight. He was there to me to pass the torch. Wanders around the Enterprise with Data, making little observations about the ship, and then he's joking with this android. It didn't feel like a cameo. It felt more like Gene telling longtime fans, it's okay, this is still Star Trek. And that, to me, was good. I mean, we even had the little Easter egg, right? Bones calls Data an old-fashioned name for an android, and then jokes that the Enterprise still has the right name. I mean, it's a subtle reminder that while everything around us is changing, Trek is not. And knowing this would be DeForest Kelley's final appearance that we know now as McCoy, it really gave the entire scene emotional weight. Probably didn't carry for audiences at the time, but it was one of those moments that, to me, simply gets better. So the crew begins investigating Farpoint, right? We finally settle into the central mystery of this episode, and this is where I think Encounter at Farpoint starts showing both its strengths, but also its weaknesses. The premise, it's intriguing. Station seems too perfect, right? Whatever visitors need somehow appears. Troy keeps sensing intense pain and loneliness from somewhere, and we don't know why. Then Groppler Zorn acts like somebody who's desperately trying to hide a secret, and the more the Enterprise crew digs, the stranger it becomes. That's all good Star Trek. The problem is the pacing. I watch it today, and there's stretches where the episode feels like it's walking instead of running to me. Scenes linger way too long. Conversations, they kind of seem to repeat the information that we already processed. And you can almost feel like the writers were trying to make sure the audience didn't miss how futuristic everything was. I get it, it's a pilot, you've got an entire new universe to establish, but it also makes part of the episode drag along more than they should. I don't think it's a bad story, I just think there's a tighter story buried inside that. Now, one thing that stood out to me this time is how many characters that are still a work in progress, right? Marina Sirtis trying to figure out how empathetic Troy should be. You've got Denise Crosby's Tasha Yar. I mean, still feels like the writers probably aren't sure what role she's going to fit on the ship. Geordi's here, right? But he isn't the Geordi that we know because he hasn't even become the chief engineer yet. Even Patrick Stewart occasionally feels like he's kind of searching for softer edges of Picard, but they're not going to emerge until later seasons, which just also goes to how good these actors were. This isn't criticism at all. It's fun to watch it in retrospect. We know where every one of these characters eventually ends up. So seeing them before they've fully developed themselves, that's pretty cool. And then there's Worf. Today, it's impossible to appreciate how groundbreaking the idea actually was because we had decades of Trek since then. But since you put yourself back in 1987, just for a second, the Klingons were some of the Federation's greatest enemies in the original series. And now one of them is standing on the bridge of the Enterprise, wearing a Starfleet uniform, like the most normal thing in the world. The episode barely even stops to acknowledge it. And I look back at it now, that's confidence to me. The writers didn't spend 20 minutes convincing us why Worf belonged on the Enterprise. They simply treated it as the new reality of the 24th century. Of course, none of us knew where that decision was going to go lead, right? Worf doesn't just become one of the best characters on The Next Generation. I mean, he's one of the most fully developed characters in all of Trek. Klingon politics, I mean, the House of Moog, all of it. Alexander, Deep Space Nine. This dude has been everywhere. Watching Michael Dorn here quietly standing at Tactical in one of his very first appearances, I kind of have to wonder if anyone on the set had any idea what they were starting. My guess is no. And that's another cool reason why revisiting these early episodes is kind of rewarding to me. Sometimes the biggest stories begin with the moments that hardly draw any attention to themselves, and Worf was definitely one of the biggest stories. So eventually, the mystery surrounding Farpoint, we get it, right? I have to say, it's one of those endings that reminds me exactly why I fell in love with this series. The Enterprise discovers that Farpoint Station's not a station. It's a living creature, an enormous space-dwelling life form that Bandy captured and forced into servitude. We know. That's why the station can seemingly create anything people ask for. It was reshaping itself to satisfy its captors. And then another massive creature appears in orbit and starts attacking the city. And it looks like we're going to build toward that typical stereotype of science fiction ending where the heroes have to stop the mysterious attacker before it's too late. But that's not what happened. The second creature is an innovator. It was searching for a mate. And suddenly the entire story shifts from conflict to a love story. If Picard realizes the solution isn't to destroy it, it's to understand it. That is classic Trek, my friends. The answer isn't bigger weapons or a spectacular battle all the time. It was empathy, it was curiosity, it was trying to figure out the truth before pulling the trigger on the torpedoes, right? Or the phasers. And looking back now, I don't think that was an accident that Gene chose to launch his new Trek with that message. I think this was a perfect way to tell audiences this was not going to be a show that solved every problem with photon torpedoes. So that resolution, it also brought us full circle to Q's trial, because in the end, Picard proved that we're worth it in exactly the way that Q challenged him. He doesn't respond with any fear, violence. He understands, and that's what earns humanity another chance. So watching it now, I keep coming back to the relationship between Q and Picard, because it's impossible for me to believe that this was ever just about Farpoint Station. I mean, I guess it could be nostalgic hindsight goggles talking, but I honestly think Q recognized something in Picard immediately, and over the years, he becomes Picard's greatest annoyance, one of his weirdest teachers in a weird way, kind of like his best friend and his believer. I mean, he's the one who forces Picard to confront humanity's limitations. He's the one who throws the Enterprise into the path of the Borg before Starfleet's ready. He gives Picard the chance to relive his own life in Tapestry. He challenges him all the time. All good things. And decades later, even after Picard has endured all this, Q returns one last time in Star Trek Picard and does it all again. I think it's one of the coolest friendships ever. And then we've got all kinds of little seeds planted throughout this episode that you almost can't appreciate until we go back through it and you've watched the entire series. Data's chasing humanity, we know that. Even though he has no idea where that journey is going to take him, we've got Worf once again standing at Tactical before anybody imagines that he's going to be the face of the Klingon culture for an entire generation of Trek fans. We've got Beverly Crusher. I mean, he arrives carrying the memory of Jack, setting up the relationship with Picard that becomes far, far more complicated than this episode. We'll get into that a lot. And then Geordi, like I said, he hasn't even found where he's going to be. Troy and Riker, the beginnings of a relationship, which won't last. And then Worf comes in. Man, there's so many things. So many things. Watching the premiere with all that in your head almost makes it feel bittersweet because the characters are standing at the beginning, but we know where they're going. I also think it's worth talking, honestly, really quick about where Encounter at Farpoint fell short. The series, I mean, I don't want this series to be driven by nostalgia. If something doesn't work, I want to call it out. And I think I go back to the pacing. The stretches that simply move too slowly, especially by today's standards. Some of these scenes overstay their welcome to me. The dialogue, it feels too formal, and you can tell the writers just, they hadn't figured out the characters. I mean, maybe Troy was written a little too broadly. Tasha definitely was not comfortable in this, and then you have Wesley Crusher. We're not even going to talk about that. None of those things ruin the episode for me, but they do keep it from reaching the level of some of the truly great episodes that we're going to talk about. But at the same time, those rough edges are charming. I mean, we were watching the birth of something. This was not peak TNG. This was the foundation, which I can respect that as well. So where do I actually land on Encounter at Farpoint? Almost 40 years later. I don't think it's one of the greatest episodes of The Next Generation at all. Honestly, I don't even think it's one of the best episodes from the first season. I mean, we've got Measure of a Man, we've got Yesterday's Enterprise, Best of Both Worlds, I could go on and on. Chain of Command. This series eventually goes on to produce some of the greatest science fiction television ever made. Compared to those episodes, I think Encounter at Farpoint, it just can't hold up. It can't compete. I also think judging it only against what comes later is kind of missing the point of this series. This episode, it had an impossible job. It was trying to convince an audience that Trek could exist without Kirk. That's not easy to do. So it's time to make it official. My score for Encounter at Farpoint, I'm going to give it a 6 out of 10. It's a good episode. It's not a great one, but it does have a solid beginning that kind of gets stronger once you know everything that eventually leads to. And my MVP for this episode, it's got to be Q. I don't think it's close. I mean, John D. Lancey walks into the very first episode of a brand new Trek series and creates one of the most iconic, unforgettable characters in the history of the franchise. Every time he was on the screen, we were watching. And knowing where his relationship with Picard eventually goes, it just makes it even better to me. Chef's kiss. My favorite moment is humanity's trial, because that single idea quietly becomes the philosophical bookend for this entire series and even more. The weakest element, I've already mentioned it twice, the pacing. I mean, there's probably a tighter 2-hour story hidden inside this pilot, and if you trim some of the fat, some of the slower scenes, it could have been even stronger. So as for the question we've been asking since the beginning, does Encounter at Farpoint still hold up? I would say yes, mostly. Some of it shows its age, but the ideas at the heart, they're timeless. That's always been, for me, what I enjoy about Trek. It does ask the big questions, humanity, curiosity, all of that. So, yeah, I think it holds up. And that's it. Our first episode. So we don't really have any rankings right now. I mean, pretty easy. We've only watched one episode, but every list has to start somewhere, right? So after one episode, Encounter at Farpoint officially is the #1 ranked episode of Star Trek The Next Generation. Eventually, we'll rank all 176. So next time, if you guys enjoy this series, we're going to jump into The Naked Now. And if you've seen that episode before, you're already shaking your head and saying, Jimmy, this one's going to get weird in a hurry. If you haven't seen it in years, trust me, I have a feeling we're going to have a lot to talk about. You should go watch it again before I get that video up. I'll see you guys soon.